It's a real pleasure to have Debra Fant with us today. She was a full-time nurse at Sierra Senior Assisted Living, and she was there while my mother-in-law was there. And the kind of care and concern she showed for all the patients was very remarkable. I think she has a very interesting program. The preview slides I saw of Tibet and the Himalayas and the faces of the people were just incredible. So I'm going to turn this over to Debra and let her have the rest of the afternoon. If you have questions, she'll be very happy to answer. Please welcome Debra Fant.
I'm just so grateful to people for being willing to come in. When we have a sunny day outside and you're willing to come in and sit in the dark, I'm here because I have a life-changing experience. I'm wondering if the back row is able to hear me. Is it on me? If it's a problem at some time, give me one of these. Or if you're nodding off, give me a couple other details. There is a cord through the middle of the room up here. And if you're walking back and forth between the two tables that have things for you to look at, please be careful that you don't trip on it. Some of the things that are here, just a quick explanation. A lot of these things came out of my experience of being in Tibet, and I wanted to share them with you so that you can touch and see and feel some of the real things. On this table there are books, and who has been to Tibet, and we found out that we were there in the same year, which was 2006. But there are some books and videos and things to stimulate your interest. And there are some handouts up here that I'll talk about later. And I didn't know how many people we would have here today, so I probably don't have enough one for everyone. But a lot of this stuff is available on the internet as well. And you might notice that I'm dressed a little differently than what I would normally do. I'm wearing what is considered a traditional garment for a Tibetan woman to wear. And this is called a chupa, and the men wear something that is called a chuba, with a B. And they're very practical garments for wear in Tibet. This has, it's forgiving in its sizing for those times when we are a little broader than not. And if someone is a pregnant woman, there's room in the garment to open it up so that there's room for her baby. There are no pockets in these garments, but this becomes the pocket. So if you see me doing something like this, it's not that I'm scratching, doing something antisocial. This is my pocket, and I won't lose things that are here. You'll notice that I'm wearing a traditional apron of the region, and I don't know that the colors are purposeful in the aprons, although there might be some meaning for different family clans that I'm not aware of. But the general message about an apron is that the woman who's wearing it is married. So if you see young women walking around without the apron, they're non-married women. I'm a widow, so I think I still get to wear my apron. Let's see. What else about this? I have to tell you, I listed photos by myself, and there are photos from my trips that are taken by my camera. I have included some things from the internet as well, so I want to be upfront that some of these are not my photographs as well. And I hope that there aren't any copyrightists in the audience. Anyway, what I've learned in sharing this information with groups of Americans is that it's often helpful to begin with a little bit of geography. I don't know about you guys, but it was a long time ago that I was in school and learning about what's where and what countries are named now. This is Asia. We've got China over here. This is the Tibetan Plateau, which is now considered to be a part of China. And depending on who you talk to, that opinion varies from place to place. When I talk about what I've seen in Tibet, right above the M and the P up here is about where the city of Lhasa is located on this map. That's the capital city of the country. And from there to the west end of the country and then back again is what I have experienced. That leaves a lot of country up here. And as I looked for some kind of a comparison about what is the context of this size, there was a comment made in one of the mapping places that said, this is about the same landmass as our country, the west, or from west of the Mississippi to the west coast. So that's a pretty huge chunk of land. What we have climate-wise and ecosystem-wise is different in these parts, but the central and west end of Tibet tends to be more dry and arid regions, and you'll see that in the photographs. Another thing that I wanted to point out, right in this little corner up here is a sacred mountain called Mount Y.A.A.S. And part of the trip that I was a part of was going from Lhasa and camping out to the west end of the country and being part of an experience out there. One of the things that is noteworthy about this, can you see how many rivers begin right here? There are 4 major waterways that flow off. And the mountain itself is a pyramid shape. And what they say is that each side of that mountain feeds one of those major rivers. So it's a very important part of Tibet, and it feeds all of Asia. So what happens there impacts people downstream. Nepal is one of the neighboring countries right here along the border. Bhutan is here. Once upon a time, the India landmass was not connected to Asia, and I won't even go after a number of years ago. I have no concept of that. But they were separate, and as they came together, the Indian continent bumped into Asia, and as you might imagine, when 2 objects meet, it has force and it has to go somewhere. So it pushed that landmass up, which is why there are huge mountain ranges all through this region. And this whole Tibetan plateau is very, very high altitude. In the city of Lhasa, they say that it's 12,000 some feet. Anybody here know what the elevation of Mount Hood might be? Okay, so when we look at Mount Hood, we go, wow, that's big and tall, isn't it? We're actually on ground level above that altitude when we arrive in the city of Lhasa. So it's a major difference from how we live here at sea level. And I guess one of the ways that I relate to being at altitude is when I visit in Central Oregon in the Bend neighborhood. You know, the air is dry, the ecosystem is fairly fragile in that they have a short growing season. Plants have more tenuous hold on leaves, there's less groundwater available. And that same thing is true in Tibet. So this is just sort of some contextual information for you. The Tibetan flag, if you happen to see that and recognize it. And it's almost impossible to talk about Tibet without being aware of this gentleman. Makes me cry. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is a title that he holds. He is the highest Lama in the land in Tibetan Buddhism. This is a job that he is born into, and he, in their Buddhist belief system is that there is reincarnation, so that when he leaves his body, he will be reincarnated in a child form and will be found by people who are capable of finding him through the clues that he will have left behind. And there's an interesting story about when he was a young boy. He went to a cabinet in the palace where he had lived as the 13th Dalai Lama, and he found a package of false teeth. He said, "These are my teeth."
Is that his name?
Tenzin Gyatso, yes, is his name. Yes. This is a picture of the Potala Palace in Lhasa, which is a multi-purpose building. It is the home of the Dalai Lama. It is the entombment place for many of the Dalai Lamas who came before him. It holds basically a university in terms of a monastery, and a library facility with a lot of the teachings from the Buddhist faith. It also is a place of government. And Tibet is one of the few places on the planet that I'm aware of that has incorporated the secular leadership of their country and their politics into the role of the sacred leader as well, so that the Dalai Lama has been both of those things. He has been the one who, has tried to negotiate with China, and he is the one who represents the government of Tibet throughout the world. That changed recently, and I'll tell you more about that in a little bit, that he has now said, I'm retiring as the leader of the secular nation. The last thing that I was aware of that I was surprised about is that there's also a prison, or that there had been a prison in this facility. So the palace is many things, all wrapped up into one. And it had been the heart of Lhasa for many years. This is a topographical map, again, looking at the incredible mountainous region, especially that border area. And I'm hoping that you guys are with it and can tell me what mountain range that is. Thank you. And the tallest mountain on the planet is Mount Everest at 29,000+ feet. K2 is up here somewhere in the Pakistan area. But these are not small mountains. This is a major thing. This was my first look at the Himalayas. I was very excited. So a brief bit of history as well, so that we're all on the same page here. In the late 1940s, and some of you may remember some of this history as it was happening, the Red occupation of China was successful, and Mao Zedong came into control of the country. And when that change happened, I guess when you think of China, what does China have in great measure? Huge population in a limited landmass. So what do you suppose they're short on?
Space.
Everything. Space.
Lebensraum.
What?
Lebensraum. Remember the German?
Lebensraum is the living room. They're also very short of water these days.
Water, natural resources, food, water. Okay. So there were a lot of reasons why Tibet looked like a plum. We've got Tibet sitting all by itself, and it has for many, many years been fairly well protected by the altitude and the difficulty of getting there and back again and staying there. But they have incredible natural resources, and space being one of those. It is also contiguous with China, so where else could we move our neighbors? We'll pack up all these Han Chinese and send them next door. And throughout the centuries, there has been a long-standing relationship between China and India and Tibet, where not only did they, on occasion, take over one another's ruling. When the kings in Tibet were in power, they used to go and take over China, and they would be in charge of China for a time, and then they'd be thrown out again. So there has been history of this kind of stuff happening politically. But in a bigger sense, that region has shared wisdom as well. That Tibet is on the Silk Road, if you will, so that there were people constantly moving through that were bringing information about the arts, medicine, and the systems of medicine, Ayurveda from India, Tibetan medicine in Tibet, and the Chinese medicine all have some real similarities. Different language to describe things, but a lot of the wisdom came out the same. So as the Red Guards looked at Tibet and ruled, what they saw was a nation that was basically undefended. And at the time that they started their invasion, there were about 5,000 cavalry people who were the military presence of Tibet, who were armed with swords and muskets. And the Red Guard came in with trucks, airplanes, modern weaponry. sort of a moot point about, can they take over? Yes, they did. And the world watched that happen, and apparently our CIA did some support of people who were in protest for some years, but that basically has been carte blanche to China to move in and take over. So one of the quotes about Chairman Mao was that he told people that his belief was that religion is poison, and he didn't want anything to do with that, and he didn't want it in his countries. So when the Red Guards moved into Tibet, one of the things that they very quickly decided to do was to desecrate and destroy things that were of value to the Tibetan people. And at that time, there were about 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. Can you even imagine 6,000 monasteries? And the monasteries were places where the children were being educated, and the nuns and young men going into the monasteries often went because they could get an education. And different monasteries had thousands of people there as monks and nuns. So in the process of this takeover, the Cultural Revolution, if you will, where the People's Republic of China liberated the people of Tibet from their feudal way of living, they burned the books and the wisdom tracts. They leveled monasteries, I've read 2 different numbers, all but 8 or 10 monasteries were completely destroyed. And some of the use of what they did with those buildings was to do the most insulting things they could think of, which was to pen animals inside the monasteries. Many, many people died in this process, and many of them were monks and nuns who were killed, tortured, imprisoned, persecuted, all of the above. Universities were demolished. The medical school was demolished in Lhasa. There was an upper crust of people who were considered the educated ruling class in Tibet, and those people were especially targeted for ridicule and vilified. The story that China was weaving was that they were the villains. They have oppressed you all this time. It was news to the common people of Tibet. We weren't sure they agreed with that. This is my guess about some of the goals that the People's Republic of China was after. They were looking for space to settle their Han Chinese people. They were interested in harvesting the natural resources, and without a lot of concern for the natural environment and the fragility of the ecosystems in Tibet. So now Tibet is the nuclear waste dump site. I don't know if that makes any sense to do that upstream from all those people. And what they're finding they need to be able to do is somehow stamp out Tibetan way of life, that people are not thrilled to have China take over and demand that everybody learn to speak Chinese in order to have a job. The language, religious practice, and they're willing to do genocide if necessary. And I guess if you listen to the news at all, you've heard stories of some of the uprisings that are happening, and that recently there are young people who are self-immolating, which means to ignite themselves as a way of protest. That their religious freedom of practice has been severely curtailed, and I can't even imagine how people are living. And I have to say here that I have been guilty myself of going to righteous indignation and anger and being hateful towards the Chinese. And I am not interested in stirring that pot and making that more intense, because it's a negative spiral that will not change what's happening. So there needs to be some balance here about what really has happened and what is happening, and with how do we hold that? How do we witness that without going to that feeling of negativity ourselves? So hopefully by the end of this time together, we'll have a chance to talk about what things are positive, what's working in the Tibetan world. But also I hope that it will awaken you to the situation that people are facing, and that we can look for a way of finding some compassion, both for the people who are being oppressed and those that are oppressing. So as things changed in Tibet, the Dalai Lama's life was at risk. And if any of you have seen some of the Hollywoodizations of 7 Years in Tibet and Kundun, they've done a pretty good job, according to the Tibetans I've talked to, about representing what happened with not just Hollywood vision, but what really happened. So the Dalai Lama hoofed it over the Himalayas into India. And the estimate that I found was that 80,000 Tibetans followed through the next 20 years, doing that, leaving. And I tried to find a hard and fast number about the estimates of the number of people that actually died still being in Tibet, and there is no common number to be had. There are estimates being made. In the literature, they talk about lost people, that nobody knows what happened to groups of people. And the Chinese are saying, oh, they left the country, maybe. We know that there are a lot of prison environments in Tibet, and a lot of people are imprisoned without a lot of excuse. You can be thrown in jail for having a picture of the Dalai Lama in your possession and do several years' time. So people who are not fed well and tortured tend to die in prison. And there are people who have survived that experience and are coming out and teaching us about it. So the early refugees that left Tibet, many of them ended up in settlements that India and Nepal made available to them. And in part that was a good thing because they had community with one another. The bad news about that was that many of those settlements were located in the southern part of India where it's at low altitude and heat and humidity is incredibly high. And the Tibetans are not acclimated to that, so it was a real hardship for people. And the kind of work that they were doing were really heavy manual labor, like working on roads with a shovel, not an equipment. So there was a lot of difficulty during those early times. So we're fast forwarding to a Tibet where the Chinese have been improving things in the internal structure for the last 40-some years. This is the area outside Lhasa that is the international airport for Tibet today. And when Mao Zedong's troops first started coming, it was a grass strip in this valley that they landed on. So yes, they have created a good facility. And you'll notice that the Chinese flag flies over it, and things are written in Chinese. This is one of the major rivers, the Y.A.A.S, Sampo, and we're following this into the city of Lhasa. And what I want to point out in this shot, and I don't know if this is considered, well, what I want to say about this is typical Tibetan housing style, where things are more communal. The houses are close together. People share the resources that they have. It's not fancy, and I don't think that there's a lot of interest in fancy. You'll notice that the Buddha is back here on the wall, and also up in this mountain area are many caves. And these are places where people go and live for several years in doing their retreats. So it's a special place to the Tibetans. And what's been happening is that those kinds of areas have been destroyed. And like any renovation in a neighborhood, if you've had low-income housing and somebody demolishes it and builds new, what happens to the people that live there? They can't afford it. I give the Chinese points for having the aesthetic to at least make it look Tibetan. But my guess is that there aren't Tibetans who could afford to live in this housing. This is a shot out over the city of Lhasa. And again, you can see that there has been a lot of change from those low houses and where the Potala Palace was, the prime spot in the city. This is an international city in its appearance now. This is what old Tibet looked like. We've got the Potala Palace up here on the hill, and this is part of a whole area of commons where people would come to do market in a given morning. This person is selling clothing. This lady has things from her garden that she's selling. This guy's office is a stool and a bag full of whatever it is that he's selling. And can anyone tell me what these little things are back here? Prayer wheels, right. And the reason for having prayer wheels is that they are carved with prayers on the outside and they contain prayers on the inside of it. And it's felt that every time you rotate that, it emanates that prayerfulness out into the world. So people walking by will just, turn all of those. And it's quite a wonderful thing. How would our community be if we went down through the town and turned prayers for Y.A.A.S? This is a close-up of the traditional building style. And I'm not sure why the dark black around the windows, but it always makes me think of a woman who's wearing heavy eyeliner. Another thing that is different about the Tibetans and their religious practice is that not only are they almost always using their prayer beads or spinning the prayer wheels to generate the merit of saying prayers, but they often go to their temple spaces in pilgrimage as well. And if someone was a farmer, he might bring some of his grain that is his harvest and donate it back to the gods or for the monks' use. Other people will bring butter, and the butter is used in the butter lamps. So you take a big spoon and go whop and add the fuel to that butter lamp flame. So this young mother is taking her young one to the Potala Palace to probably do teaching of him of what's there and why it's important and what we do. And you'll see he's wearing the chuba. And what a wonderful garment it is, because he's got something like either sheepskin or wool on the inside of this garment, so that when it's cold, he puts his arms inside, and the sleeves are long enough that you don't need mittens, or you don't lose your mittens, which is my thing. And when you get warm, you take one arm out, and if you get really warm, you take both arms out and wrap it around, and then you're fine. And you don't lose your coat. Here are some other ladies that are pilgrims coming to the Potala, and who knows how far they've walked to get to this day of doing their pilgrimage, but it's a big deal to people in Tibet. This young man is a Tibetan tour guide, and he was getting ready to take us up these narrow, steep flights of stairs. And this is at 12,000 feet, and it's our first day in town. Yes, we just about didn't make it. It was arduous walking. Another thing that you'll see throughout Tibet are the pictures of the emanations of the deity in different forms that are painted on rocks. There will be mani stones, and people will carve the prayers into these stones and leave them along walkways or near stairways or out in the country. There will be a whole pile of things. Well, these became great fun for the Red Soldiers to break. If we want to discourage your religious practice, we're going to stomp all your mani stones. When we were traveling, we stopped at one point along the roadside for a bathroom break, and the women go off that way and the men go off that way. And if you're wearing something like this, it's easy because you just squat and do your thing, but for those in jeans, it was a little more breezy, shall we say.
Do you want us to wait to ask the questions later?
Go for it.
Okay, I was wondering, some of the religious things seem to be tolerated because it brings in tourism dollars.
Yep.
So it's, thank goodness for that then. I mean, it could all have been obliterated.
Right. Yeah. Did everybody hear her comment? Of the temples and monasteries that were remaining standing, there are about 8 to 10 of them, and many of those have been re-beautified. That they've redone the paintings, and they have the illusion that those are living spaces for religious practice. Not all of them are.
Or museums.
Yeah. And when Western tourists go to Lhasa, it's required that we go visit X, Y, and Z, all those places, so that we're sure that everything's fine in Tibet. And meanwhile, there are people who look like monks, who are really monks. They're informers, and people who make sure that the rules are being followed. There were armed guards in the Potala who actually challenged our tour guide because he was telling us too much information. This is a piece of Mani stone. So when you come up to look at things, have a feel of it. It's important to me. Grateful to have it, yes.
Is it granite or slate or?
I think it's slate, and some of them look like they have a lot of mica in them. So I'm not entirely sure what the stone is. So here's some of the faces of people in Tibet who become monklets, as I call them. Students who learn to read and write and to recite and to remember the sacred scripts. This group of older monks is being taught the tradition of the debating. And if you've seen some of our local monks that come to visit here, they've demonstrated the debate where they do the... it's quite an interesting process to watch. And this lovely face, I wasn't sure if this was a male or female person at first, and I've settled on I think it's female. But she's been a nun her whole life, I assume. And she's earning a little bit of money by offering blessings outside one of the temples. This was actually in Nepal, but it's in the Tibetan quarter. Talk to my computer on this side, apparently. Battery. Any other questions while I'm fuddling with my battery here?
I'm noticing the gridiron work behind her, and haven't a lot of those been sold, into the Western markets? So removed carved doors and architectural work like that has been removed. And,
The antiquities.
yeah.
Yeah, and the guards search your bags carefully for people trying to take things like that out. This is a yogi that we were taken to visit. He's a medicine practitioner. He's a Tibetan physician. And instead of calling him Lama, he is a yogi because he has a wife. And this is his grandson. But he was a wonderful man. Here's a big butter lamp at one of the temples, and some smaller ones. And it's very much like in the Catholic tradition where you light candles for prayers or honoring someone for some intent. A good friend of mine died while I was there, and I was in some distress over it, so I was asking them to light candles for her. Here's another beautiful face. And when I think about the years that this woman has lived and wondering what she has experienced, what she has seen, I wish I could have talked to her. There was no common language between us, but I did ask permission to take her picture, and she agreed that would be okay. And when I showed her her pictures, she was doing this, and I didn't understand what it meant, and someone else was able to tell me that she was embarrassed by how she looked. And what I would have loved to have said to her was, I think you're beautiful. So here's renovated Lhasa.
It's like Disneyland.
This is the central square in Lhasa, and the Jokam temple is one of the more important of the temple spaces. In one of the kings of Tibet, he very wisely married several women at once. One was a Nepali princess, and the other was from China, a princess. And they both brought with them not only diplomatic connections to their countries, but they brought some exquisite statuary of the Buddha that is housed here in Jokhang. And amazingly enough, that made it through the Cultural Revolution. It's a big deal. This photo is taken from on top of that building, so we're looking back out over the Barclay Square. And prior to the invasion, the area around this was housing of Tibetans, and it was, their central market area. It was the heart of that community. What we have down here now are the vendor stalls, selling the kata blessing scarves, the statuary, the incense, whatever you need, whatever you don't need. This is an incense burner down in front. But each day, many Tibetans do the circumambulation around this temple, and I'm not sure how many times they will walk around, but it's doing prayers, it's honoring their tradition. Oops. And this is also the place where a lot of the disharmony has happened in armed rebellions. You can see the Potala is right up here, so this used to be the center point of the city, and this was the heart down here. We can see where a building has been raised, and who knows what's coming next. This is the interior of the Jokhang. And the means of building fascinated me. This is all sticks that have been covered with mud and painted. And this image is the Kala Chakra mantra, which is a teaching. It's like having a flag that represents a whole body of things. This image is a whole teaching, and then a prayer stone that's down in front. And this wrathful deity up here on the ornament is keeping things safe, I guess. Another of the big monasteries is Debra Monastery, and this is also outside the city of Lhasa, right on the Y.A.A.S River. You can get a feel for this isn't a very verdant area. Not much green here at all, and this is spring. This is the wet season. Another of the major monasteries is the Tashi Lungpo Monastery that is west of Lhasa, and this one had 6,000 monks at one time. And the second Lama in rank underneath the Dalai Lama is the Panchen Lama, and he would be like the university president of the whole country's systems. That his area of expertise and focus was to manage the monasteries and the education. And during the Cultural Revolution, the Panchen Lama, I don't know if it was his choice or if it was determined that he would stay in the country when the Dalai Lama fled, but he was taken to China, and they tried to do re-education with him and felt he was ready to go back to his monastery position, and it quickly became apparent that he was not going to kowtow, and he was not going to keep his mouth shut, and he suddenly died. On this day, we've got some pilgrims that are getting ready to go up and do the tour of the temple spaces up here. I wanted to point out this little vehicle. This is like a small motor. Yeah, it's like a tractor. In the country area, you'll see 30 people crammed into one of these, and they're too long.
Is that a structure on the very top of that mountain?
Yeah, I heard that too.
Up in the center underneath the
Right here?
yeah.
They're prayer flags. And I think there's a snowfield that's behind them. I'm a sucker for doors and doorways and seeing what's inside. This is like a peek into somebody's courtyard or their laundry room, if you will. We have a stack of kindling wood. There's a ladder so that you can get up to the top of that wall area. The actual house is up these other steps and inside. If this were in the country, you would see splats of yak dung that would be on the walls, and it would be there to dry out, and it'd be used for fuel. love this. This is so cool. Anybody take a guess at what it is?
Solar?
It's a parabolic curve that focuses the solar energy onto the tea kettle. So if somebody stops by, you've got hot water for tea. Okay, and here's some of the monks that are still left in this monastery. This wall up here, this whole building, the sole purpose for it was to hang a big tanka, you know, the great big fabric paintings of Buddha. I just thought that was cool. And people are walking in respect around these torii. This is the entrance to one of the temple spaces. And people will go in and the statue is there. You walk around the statue, you do your prayers. There's a place to make your donations and offerings, and then you move on to the next one. I love this. Somebody earlier, I think it was Prue, was commenting that in these arid, cold places, so many times you'll see the use of really intense color to enliven things and to warm it. But look at the antiquity that's here. I have no idea how old this wood is, but being as dry as it is, it doesn't do what our wood does. Just goodness. And again, this is the Kala Chakra image. And this was a happy accident. We went up a stairwell and I found myself here looking at this door, and look at this threshold. How many feet would it take to wear down that threshold, and over how many years? We who think 200 some years is old. And the time-trippy feeling of seeing all of these pilgrims in here, this young woman with her little baby on her back, and bustling around doing their process. Now, I was taking pictures, and this woman came up behind me, and again, we don't have any language in common, but she made it very clear that she wanted her photograph taken now. Took me by the arm and went over and sat down on this wall. And she's wearing probably her finest clothing and jewels. And in Tibet, in the old way, when you see big headdresses that have big chunks of gems and things on them, generally that is the family's jewels. You know, that's their resource, that's their bank account. And I wished that I could give her a photograph. I was able to show it to her on my camera. One of the people we were traveling with had an instant camera, and we almost had a couple of knockdown, drag-out brawls over, do my child, and take the picture and hand them the Polaroid film. That's really something. I was wanting to offer my apple to this little horse, you know, being a sucker for animals, and I thought, well, I didn't eat my apple at lunch. The man looked at me like I had lost my mind. He ate the apple. But check out this saddle. We've got rubber inner tubing as a protector. And if somebody were going to ride that horse, they would put a rug over the top. Right.
You mentioned the apple. What kind of food supplies are there for the people? I didn't see much by way of in the market. What kind of food, and is there any abundance of it?
Barley.
You know, what?
Barley.
Barley is one of the big crops of Tibet. You know, the diet is very simple. In the nomadic traditions, they use barley flour and put the yak butter tea with it, so that it makes, like if you put Wonder Bread, made it mushy, and it's like a big glop of carb that you're eating. There isn't, and they will eat some yak meat and goat and that sort of thing. We didn't have a lot to do with the food system while we were there, so I can't really answer how much abundance there was. When we were in a hotel that was, you know, catering to Westerners, they managed to have some fresh foods for us.
Most of the fresh fruit was grown in greenhouses that were put in by the Chinese. They also put in wells so that they're watered, and they, you know, it's all greenhouse fruit.
Yes.
It seems that there's there's not a very good case for China invading, since the country seems to be very poor, there seems to be rather minimal agriculture, so it's not really supplying vast amounts of space and water.
Well, in other parts of Tibet, in the eastern regions, there are actually rainforests and forests of huge rhododendrons. And in the northern areas, there are big grasslands. So what we're seeing is a limited view. It would be like if we were filming in the high desert. We're not seeing all of it. But I think the Tibetan diet in general hasn't been real expansive about fresh vegetables and fruits. And you're right, Carol, that we did see a lot of concrete block structures like this that had glass down the front that were places to grow food. So it's an issue. This is an inland freshwater lake. Sometimes if you look at those mirror images sideways, you get to see interesting figures in them.
Is it a large cockroach?
Yeah,
This is the Rorschach test.
There's some more interesting.
This is a typical rural area. There, it wasn't by a town. It was just this little grouping of houses. And instead of having a car or a truck out back, we've got yaks out back. And again, look at the greenery that's here. It's very, very sparse.
Where do they get their water?
I assume that there are wells in some of these places. There are some springs every now and again.
And devices on the roof. Those the four corners, those are all decorated gods. And there are some water catchment.
So cistern kinds of things. Did you have?
No, I said they had somewhat catch basins that hold.
Okay, and this is out in the nowheres as well, rural area. And this was the transition time in about 2006 where the Chinese were starting to build structures periodically that were said to be going to become community facilities, the police stations, maybe a school, who knows what. But the jobs of heavy manual labor are going to the poor Tibetan families that are there, and they will probably never use any of these things. And the Tibetan children are not welcome in school unless they can pay tuition. That's not going to happen. But this isn't unusual, for these people live very frugally and very poor. Big sky. We're getting to that western end where the mountain is, and what we're seeing here is one mountain range, and what we can't see on this side is where the sacred mountain is, and in between is a lake that is called Lake Mansarovar, and it is considered sacred to both the Hindus and the Buddhists. So a lot of the pilgrims will come to this area first and do ablations and purging of clearing themselves before they go on to the pilgrimage around the mountain. And in our group we had both Hindus and Buddhists and a fair amount of us Christians, and we were all instructed that we were some way going to get in that water while we were there. This is 17,000 feet elevation, wow. And even though it's June, it's chilly. And the figure out here that you see is another of the characters in this group. She's a 79-year-old Australian woman who decided to have a bath out there. So she's standing out there and we're all together having a bath. This is the valley that is around, or at the foot of Mount Y.A.A.S, and we were on our way here because of the Y.A.A.S festival, and some of you may recognize that term. In the Buddhist tradition. It's a celebration of Buddha's birthday and also his transformation. And in Tibetan, it's Sagadawa, so it's one or the other. And the belief is that on this auspicious day, it's the full, I forget how they describe it, but it's the full moon a certain amount of time after the new year. So the date changes from year to year, but it's said that the Buddha comes down in a ball of light and is joined by the Christ, and that they stand on this massive rock ledge and do their sacred rituals, and that produces blessings for the community for the coming year, or for the people of the earth. And some of you may remember hearing about Madame Blavatsky. I love that.
Yeah.
She saw this festival and described what was happening and the sacred geometry and the patterning that they were using. So I went into this fully expecting we were going to have visitors like that. Foolish me. First of all, I neglected to look at what time was the full moon really, so I didn't know if I was there. But this is dawn with Mount Kailash being in movement. And across the canyon as it was getting sunlight. And we hoofed it up over that ridge to see what was happening. And these are all prayer flags behind this pilgrim. And this is what was happening down in the valley. This is probably what most human beings would see rather than Madame Blavatsky's vision. This structure is called a tarbosh. It's like a great big flagpole, and it has prayer flags that are attached to it. So we have the local lama and his entourage are here overseeing things, and we have pilgrims that are circumambulating this whole area doing prayers. And the process for the day was getting that thing to stand up straight, and it took hours. And each time they made some kind of forward progress with it, the crowd would go, so. And I don't know what that meant exactly, but it was supportive. And you can see it's almost upright at this point. So. And here's some of the people sitting with us around. And I would guess that these ladies are nomads from the way that they're dressed. And no, they don't wash their clothes and they don't bathe very often. I wouldn't either if I lived there. And contrasted with this young man who looks like he's an urbanite. And people had stacks of what are paper prayer flags, the wind horse image, and they would throw them into the air and they would just flutter, and we found them for miles afterwards. It was really cool. But that's believed to be disseminating those prayers and the good wishes. And there is the mountain. Wow. This is the south face of this pyramid mountain. And this area up here is the giant plateau that Madame explained. That's where the Buddha came to. Interestingly enough, this is also a place where the Tibetans do air burial. And this is not for the run-of-the-mill Tibetans, because this is a sacred place, so it's the high. But if you've noticed the ground and how rocky it is, would you want to do any digging for a grave? I wouldn't. So the way that bodies are disposed of in Tibet is either through burning or through the sky burial. And there are a caste of people who are the men who do the divvying up of the bodies, and then the birds and the dogs, the wild dogs, take care of the leftovers. Yes?
And the birds are very well trained. They actually wait for the call before they come over. So they don't come over when they're chopping, they just wait. And when they call, that's when the vultures.
Well,
Working in harmony, aren't they? In one of the tour guides that I was reading, they were talking about this pilgrimage, and there's There's another sky burial on the north side of the mountain. And he was commenting about it's an auspicious place to die. I'm thinking, okay. And then he talked about the packs of wild dogs that are there, and I'm thinking, they're probably looking at people like me, licking their chops, going, ooh, chicken. You know, chicken tenders. Oh, dear. But the pilgrimage around this mountain, and these mountains that are sacred do not get climbed. That's just not done. Instead, people will walk around the 32 miles around the base of this mountain. And this is over 17,000 feet elevation. The pilgrims from the area, Tibetans, often do this in a full day, which just blows my mind. Many visitors, pilgrims, do it in 3 days. I would have said it would be more like 5 days would have been reasonable. It's pretty arduous, and the yaks are the ones that haul everybody's stuff around the mountain. Can you see habitation in this picture? Yeah. That's a monastery. Zooming in. I can't quite imagine living a whole different life. This is the path that goes up and around the mountain. And being June, we've got water in this creek, and it is runoff from the glaciers. Oops. That last bit was the west side of Y.A.A.S. This is a wonderful little horse that saved my carcass. We had been walking for 10 hours that day, and I realized only after we had gotten well into it that none of us had any instructions about where were we to stop. How would we know when we got there? What was the plan? And I ended up sitting down on the trail side because I realized that I just didn't have anything together anymore. And if anybody has ever had a hypoxia where you're short of oxygen, you're the last one to know that you're in trouble because your brain isn't thinking very clearly. So I'm sitting there and I think, well, maybe I should get the oxygen out of my backpack. And I pull it out and it looks like a hairspray can. And the instructions are all in Chinese characters. And I realized, I don't know how to use this. I don't know how to open it and make it work. And I'm looking at it, and this very kind young man shows up, and he's from Nepal, and he, like a lot of other regional people, come and walk this Kora and are in service to people like me who don't know what they're doing and who find themselves in trouble. And he was trilingual, which was helpful because he could talk to this Tibetan man who had the horse and made arrangements that I paid for the right to be carried to the end of our journey. And some of the people out here had been riding little horses, but capitalism being what it is, these guys quickly figured out that when there's that much competition for horses, you can dump people off at the tea house and then charge them again to go to the end of it. So this little horse did me great service. I was very grateful. And we got to be part of the yak train as we moved along. And I was so thrilled because the people were talking to one another and I couldn't understand what was being said. They were probably saying, oh, look at this one. Took 2 guys to hoof her into that saddle. It was exciting. It was really cool. And you'll notice that the water is murky, and that's silica that's coming out of the glacial melt. And if you have a little bit of constipation, just have a little water and you'll be good. This was where we were stopping for the night. This is the river. This is the glacier that's feeding that little river, and this is the bridge across. This is one of the groups in the valley that was spending the night there. There were more tent areas over on this side. These 2 groups of cold, shivering, tired people were our group. And we had nothing with us at this point. We're watching the sun heading for the west horizon, and we're going, oh dear. someone from one of the camps over here brought us a kettle of tea, which was an incredible kindness because we had people who were in trouble with being cold and who were thirsty and tired. And some of the young men that were there as our support crew sent a couple of people over to the monastery to inquire if we didn't have our things catching up to us, could we spend the night there? One of the women in our group was desperately ill at that point, and these young men piggyback carried her down to one of the tented areas to help take care of her. It was a really incredible moment. I'm sitting with my back against a rock, like, I've got my polar pants in my calf. I use pants in my calf. I'm really cold now that I've got my really cold. I don't have the energy to do it. And once I did finally get my foot in one leg, it's like, we're talking pretty arduous stuff. And I'm not incredibly physical. I'm not incredibly physical responsibility. Part of it's my responsibility. But we had well up into the mid-70s. Well up into the mid-70s when this was coming. This fascinates me. This vastness of seeing one shoe on a highway somewhere. I always want to know what's the story. I always want to know what shoe. How did that shoe? How did somebody let go of a shoe? How did somebody let go of a shoe? And which is more valuable? And which is more valuable? This is the north face of Mount. This is the north face of Mount. This was as he laid out in the night. He laid out in the hostel area here. The hostel had slabs of stone slabs with their pads and put their sleeping bags on. That was the motel. That was the motel. We sat in this tent. We sat in this train car. It was probably 10 o'clock at night. And it was snowing night when we got to our tents. I ended up with a water bottle that had hot water in it. Put it in between my knees as I was sinking down my knees as I was saying. The next morning I woke up, I was still there. I was still halfway into my sleeping bag. Over the tent and there were yaks sitting there chewing their crackers. There are some beautiful things. There are some beautiful things that grow in this climate as well. This is one of the inland seas. This is one of the inland. Somebody was mentioning the pink salt. The pink salt. Yeah. This is the inland sea. So we've got salt production. We've got salt production. That's why they have coral. That's why they have coral. So mine. That this little cart belongs to. This little cart belongs to. Oops. That little cart belongs to. That little cart belongs to nomadic people. Yes.
Any theories on how you got an inland sea there?
Yes.
Is that because the continents came together and pushed up the ocean?
Yep. But I can't tell you the spaciousness of this. It would have been interesting to see how deep that ravine was. See how deep that ravine was. Wasn't going to walk there. Okay, so again, just reminding us. We've got huge mountains across here, and here is Everest, from local level. I don't know. They said there's Everest. There's Everest. The tallest one. It's also here. This is not Everest. This is not Everest. This is some of the mountains. My question to you guys is, what would it take to motivate you to put on a backpack and to walk through that?
A cabin crowd. Being used on me.
Things would have to be pretty bad where you are to make that look livable, wouldn't it?
Yeah. You know, I think Everest is the tallest, but not the highest.
You want to explain that?
Mauna Kea in Hawaii, I believe, is the highest mountain, 31,000.
Oh, from its base underwater.
They measure the bottom. She's a troublemaker and everything. A mind bender.
We're at a transition point here where we're going to be talking about the people who have walked out, and I'm wondering, do you guys need a stretch break or a bathroom time to get up and move a little bit, and then we'll come back to this, or should we just plow through?
Us needs to make a decision.
Keep going. All right. If anybody needs to get up and go, feel free. Okay. All right. So we're looking at this. All right. So we're looking at this. How would I get through there? How would I get there? Do I have? What would I there? Do I have? Who would take me there? Who would take me there? That I wouldn't get lost. That I wouldn't get lost. So some of the things that have been going on. Some of the things that have been going on this side here, where I don't know if you're aware. There are and have been for many years now forced sterilizations, women who are becoming aborted, because they have been determined to have too many children. Forced. Yes, forced. Yes, forced. This is outside the Jokhang, and here are some of the rebellions of some of the going on in that area, and the harsh crackdowns that happened after. We've got monks who are doing peaceful gatherings, who are said to be threatening the police, threatening them with rocks. That's how they're armed. Excuse me. How about this for contrast? I would be intimidated by anyone dressed in this manner. That carrying a weapon. This man has bare feet.
Did you take these?
No, these are from the internet. And again, when China has great numbers of beings, they have huge presence and a military presence. If they're going to somebody's house and they're saying we're arresting you, they won't go with 3 or 4 people. They'll take 30 troops. It's clearly intimidation. And this one just came from the Tibetan front. It says the PLA armored personnel carrier with the city of Dartsedo, displays the banner saying, Tibetans and Han are one thing. A little discordant message, would you say? March 10th is the anniversary of the Tibetan uprising in 1919, and they were brutally repressed at that time. They had another go at it, and were brutally repressed. One of the young men that was part of our cadre of people taking care of our group went to prison. I don't know what it was that he was said to have done. We heard from him by email, and he was not able to be real specific in what he said. He said, I can't. He's a 20-something-year-old man. And I would have a hunch that if the news is able to get the news things out of Tibet, we're going to hear about more of this same sort of thing going on this year. Because we've had, the whole country is in lockdown. Western tourists are not allowed in. News is not able to be generated. People are sneaking things out. So here's a mountain pass. In many situations, they're walking out, people get walking out because they have less chance of being seen by the military presence. One of the things that puzzles me is if they don't want Tibetans to be Tibetans, why are they working so hard to keep people into that? Why don't they allow them to leave? Does anybody have any insights about
You need a supply of labor.
That's all right.
They're just not proud of what they're doing. You know, they don't feel good.
I hope that's true.
But there's still many tours allowed in Lhasa.
Yes, people.
That amazes me.
Westerners.
It amazes me that they allow that.
Well, Westerners are welcome to come because we spend money, and we are part of their facade of, everything was fine. We didn't have any problems. Yeah.
I tried to get a job. I was working in China and I tried to get a job teaching in the University of Lhasa. They didn't hire Americans. Canadian, Australians, New Zealand, no Americans. And that was in the 90s. Americans were not allowed to work in the university.
No Tibetan music?
He was the comic relief. Here we've got walking out. These folks walking, and many of the people who arrive in the West end up with the West. Many people are coming out with active tuberculosis, have significant health issues when they reach. So the hill city of Dharamsala is the heart of where Tibet is. Their government, where the Dalai Lama is residing. And it's at altitude, it has a cooler climate, so it's people that live there. Okay, so recapping, we have about 80,000 people. The second wave was people in the 1980s when the rules kind of loosened up a bit, and people had more right to come and go. The annual estimates for the last number of years have been 3,000 to 4,000 a year coming out and walking. And the recent estimates are that there's less than 1,000, not because people don't want to come. So here are some refugees living in the West now. The young people working here are in sort of a sheltered workshop, acclimate to their new living environment, learning to speak Hindi, learning to speak English, to get along. They may not have a lot of marketable skills like the traditional art forms. This woman is a well-educated faculty member at the Mense Medical Institute. And she, among others, were teaching about Tibetan medicine, using PowerPoint, and doing that all in the second language. I have trouble with PowerPoint in general. and this group of young men, is the only Tibetan I've ever met. So the challenges of people living in language is one of them. Language, if any of us have ever tried to become fluent, try second language. It's not a simple matter. I guess I have great respect for people who are able to do that. In some of the books over here, there are many stories about other people who are belonging to that home. And there is a great sadness. That people can't come home. There are families that are split. West, and some who are still in Tibet. Citizenship is an issue because every single country has different rules about what they can do, what they can't do. And what I've heard from some of my Tibetan friends is that many people will apply for citizenship as soon as they're citizenship in this country, but they retain their Tibetan citizenship as well. Civil rights and immigration issues. In India, for instance, Tibetans are not allowed to. If there are Indians and Tibetans applying for one job position, the Indians are going to have precedence in hiring. Remember what some of the other details are. But there's disparity. In the United States, if people become citizens, they have equal rights. Lifestyle and health issues are a huge challenge. If you can be somebody who has been in Tibet, a childbearing age woman, she bears this baby without having prenatal care. She has a midwife who comes and helps her. She generally gives birth because it's considered. When she comes to the West, our routines are that you spread your legs and have a pelvic exam. How difficult adjustment to adjust. If you break it down into pieces, how differently we do people have been raised. There is an effort to spread Tibetan medicine around the world. For those that have seen several years in Tibet, the man befriended the Dalai Lama, back in the 40s. When he died, his bequest for his estate was that it would build another medical institute in Austria, so that there is another institute for Tibetan medicine, teaching practitioners. Another big issue is the identity issues, that Tibetans being born in India don't quite, but they also don't fit to Tibet. And their lifestyle has become more westernized because of Tibet. Another thing that I haven't read in my exploration is that there's a growing gap from the people who are living in Tibet that are actually beginning to acclimatize to the Chinization, that are watching Chinese movies and literature, music, and who are beginning to speak the language and fit in. The Tibetans in exile look at them with horror and say, you're a traitor. So there are big social issues here. But lest we get totally bummed out, there are also things that are working for the Tibetan exiles. There has been a huge rebuilding of monasteries and nunneries in the West. And even in the United States, there are facilities where a Tibetan leader will come and oversee that education. And I think it's fair to say that the whole world has benefited from having Tibetans out with us in the world, because they are showing us a different way of living and being than what we would normally see. Tibetan medical schools have rebuilt in Dharamsala in India, hospitals and universities. Their young children are being taken care of. Tibetan children's villages were initially created for people who were children who were orphaned after the refugee, when they came out of Tibet. But many families weren't able to take care of their kids. Both parents were working 12 to 18-hour days. There was nobody to watch the children. So they decided that they would entrust their kids to the Tibetan children's villages. And they are residential family units in these different villages where kids are being taught their own language, their fine arts, the Buddhist studies, and all of the Western knowledge base and skills that they need. If they get a 12-year-old who hasn't been to school before, they start him in kindergarten. And he stays at Tibetan Children's Village until he is ready to be in the job market and be a marketable person. So it's an incredible resource for the Tibetans. And they've started to have summer camps for kids that are growing up in Europe and the United States and Canada, so that they get to go to the Tibetan children's villages, meet their peers, practice their language, and feel included in it, that there is a mingling in it, community building. And I would say that the communities in exile are really strong forces. There's a huge group in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And there's some wonderful things going on that they're doing in that area. So religious freedom and access to the Dalai Lama is another good thing. And Tibetan democracy is a huge piece. Back when His Holiness was a young man, he was picking Heinrich Harder's brain about how does democracy work, teaching me about it. And he has been working towards making that happen. These are some of the pictures from the children's village. This little guy was brought in his mother's arms when he was less than 6 months of age, and she walked him out and then went back to Tibet. Any ideas why she went back?
Other children? Other children?
Could be. If she stayed, her family would be tortured. So people will walk out, leave their children, or send their children with somebody that they trust, and then go back. And it's a belief that these kids will have a better life. And that just makes my stomach turn over to think about leaving my children. But these kids living in village groups learn how to take care of themselves. This is a solar-powered water heater. They do laundry together outside. Big kids helping little kids. This group of the little tiny kids were doing a show for us as visitors. They were doing the Itsy Bitsy Spider in Tibet. So we could sing along. This group of kids is part of a marching band at the village. And this was at a time in 2008 when Beijing was hosting the Olympic Games. And Tibetans obviously were not welcome. So they threw their own Olympic Games. And this was the day that they did their opening ceremonies, and it was pretty impressive. And they had maybe 24 athletes, and they were just normal kids participating. And on their facility, it says, "Come to learn, go to serve." Instead of saying, "Go Wildcats." This is a grandfather holding his little one. So religious freedom is a good thing. The Central Tibetan Administration is the government of Tibet in exile. And like I said, up until about a year ago, His Holiness was the head of that government. This young man has now been elected the Prime Minister. He is a PhD educated young man who is well positioned to work in the international political arena. His Holiness has stepped out of that role to protect his government from incursion by China at his death. There's no way that they can touch his government now. Okay, so the distribution of refugees. India has probably the most of all nations, Nepal, Bhutan, and the rest of the world is sharing almost 19,000 people as well. And here are some of the faces that I have met. This lady created my chupa for me. And these ladies are part of that workshop. They're newly arrived in India. And this gentleman, another elder, and what has he experienced? What's his story? I wish I could have talked to him. This last summer, His Holiness did a major teaching in Washington, D.C., and these are three people that I worked with while we were there. We were doing volunteering. This lady is a retired professor of public health at Rutgers University. This young man works as a banker in Washington, D.C. And this is his beautiful wife. And here's a mishmash of some of the modernization of people in exile. Cell phones. So the benefit to the whole world of having His Holiness available. This was a very important experience. There's a man living in the Washington, D.C. area who asked His Holiness to come and do the Kala Chakra teaching, which is about peace. And they felt like it was important to leave the seeds of peace at our nation's capital, to carry that vibration and hopefully influence our lawmakers in their politics and their decision-making. And during this time, I've forgotten who this man is. He's one of the high Catholic leaders in Washington, D.C., that he came to wish His Holiness a happy birthday and had his say about what was going on. And these two fellows, this is Gandhi's nephew, and this is Martin Luther King III. So, and one of the people that couldn't be there was Desmond Tutu. But they are great friends. And I mean, when you look at these men together and the leadership of what they're teaching, it's pretty remarkable. And their teaching is about peace, about how to protest with peace, how to use prayer vigil. I don't know about you guys, but I get to a place where I need to go, what can I do? I need to do something about this. This impassions me. This makes me want to take action. So I guess what my invitations might be is to learn more about Tibet and the current events going on. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I've got books that are my books and some of the movies that I've accumulated. Our libraries have those resources available to us. I don't know if Netflix does. But participating by donating is another thing that we can do from the West. And I would say that in the sponsorship programs, $30 for a month will take care of one nun or one monk or one child at the school. That's $360 a year. That's pretty small when we look at what it costs us to live. And if anybody feels pulled to do that, I've got some information about how to connect with those agencies. They take donated items like kids' coats and sweaters, mittens, boots, that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be new. There are people who volunteer in Dharamsala at the hospitals and in the social programs. It's another way that people give back. Being available to meet local Tibetans is another way of learning more. There's nothing like one-on-one relationships to figure out, hey, we're more alike than we're separate here. We've got a fairly good-sized community of Tibetan people living in Portland. There are events that happen there from time to time. We have monks who come here on fundraising tours. We haven't been part of that. It's usually great fun to be part of that. We can meet those individuals and get an up-close look at how they do their work. Most of all, I think the prayerful support or the practice of Tonglen that the Buddhists teach is really the most potent tool that we have, because it brings us into a heart-to-heart connection, and it keeps us out of that I need to blame and judge what's going on. So if you do a prayer practice, consider holding some of these faces in your mind's eye, some of those little kids, and wish them well for their living. Hold the faces of those soldiers who are standing there, like your husband said, they probably are not proud of what they're doing. They probably could be supported with prayer as well. And maybe there will come a time when they say, no, I don't want to do this anymore. Let's imagine a world that we'll get over ourselves. We'll figure out how to live together peacefully. That's my pitch, please. Thank you. Knowing at least how to say one thing in Tibetan language. This is a greeting that's a lot like aloha. It has several meanings, depending on what you need. But tashi delay. So if you meet a Tibetan and you say tashi delay, you probably are going to get a big grin in response. Generally, it's auspicious blessings. There are a couple of extra resource sheets up at the front for those of you that are in the back who haven't gotten one. Are there questions that anybody would like to